important to answer the questions of skeptics. But that's also the kind of thing that some of us may go our whole life and never have run into a skeptic that would ask those specific questions. And or you maybe have never wondered that before, some of the questions that we talked about. I think this week, and we're going to spend a good part of next week, we're going to talk about the whole idea of the questions related to creation and evolution. And that is an area that we all run into, that has become more and more significant over time. And we're all going to run into discussions of this and opinions on that. It's the type of thing that if we have kids or grandkids, we see that they're exposed to this and they're really forced to deal with it. If we don't know how to deal with these subjects, it's not only they're all out there, but in a lot of ways, I think this is probably arguably one of the most foundational aspects of apologetics that we deal with now. I can go trying to talk to somebody about issues of faith, and the fact is that if you don't believe there's a God, if you believe that we've evolved, I can't talk about any of the other things that we've talked about. I mean, the fact is that if we've got to at least start with the idea that there is a God who created us, before you get into the Bible, Jesus, before you get into any of the other things that we might talk about, this is so foundational. And so it's really important that we spend some time on it. And so I look forward to being able to do so. And again, as we've said from pretty much every week, what we're doing is that we are doing this with more of a introductory. We're going to cover a lot of different things today. It's going to go quick. We'll always give you, invite you to say if you have comments, questions, please. We want to make this interactive. But I also say that there's, that I'm not going to go into the level of depth that any of these subjects deserve. And on the one hand, I'm going to go really quickly, maybe too quickly sometimes. On the other hand, you just can't, I'm going to scratch the surface of something that you could easily spend an hour on, something that I'll spend 5 minutes on. And we wanted to continue to mention that there are a lot of other resources. And so as we talk about this whole idea of science, creation, if for those that have the notes in hand, it's always on the last page. Likewise, there's notes that are available online that you can click on and open them up on your computer. And but if you look on the last page, there's some resources. First of all, it's a book. There's a case. Actually, these are both books and video series. So right now Media is this video library that we are members of at a church. You can have access to any of the series that are on that. And if you need help to get signed up, please call the church office. It's a library that is available to you for free, through us as a church. Case for Creator is both a book and a video series where they go through this, and it just kind of lays out this introductory things for creation. Likewise, last week we talked a lot about God's crime scene and J. Warner Wallace, and where he was talking about this whole idea of looking at the resurrection and treating it like a crime scene, looking for the evidence. And now he does the same thing with creation. And again, this it's an excellent book and a video series, so you can look at it either way. And then if you wanted to go one that's just a video series, Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis, again on Right Now Media. And so there's some really good resources that will take you a little deeper on that. And let me begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll dive into the material. Father, I thank you for the privilege, again, of spending this time. I thank you for the fact that you have called us to be people of faith that have a faith that is rooted in truth. Father, I thank you that even as when we talk about creation and science, that Father, that you again have called us to something that's not a faith that's closing our eyes, that goes against logic, goes against reason, goes against even science, but Father, that you call us to a reasonable faith, a faith that is totally consistent with what we can know, with reason, and even with the evidence of science. Father, I pray that you'd help us to just grow in confidence in what we believe and why we believe it. Father, not only to be confident in our own faith, but Father, to have a confidence that we can engage with and interact with those that might be skeptics, that we can defend our faith to our to our kids and our grandkids, that those that are questioning. Father, help us to be strong in representing you well on these issues. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Now, I do want to mention for those that are online, again, we'd love to have you participate. If you would like to text a question or comment in, please just do so to 330-644-6121. It should be on the screen, and we'll get those texts and try to respond to that as well. Now, we've talked about some of the resources. Let me begin and really just talk about this idea that what we're looking at is this question of where do we come from? That's the core question. And it's so foundational, again, to everything we believe. If we aren't solid here, it undermines everything else in the Bible. And so that's why when you think even in the Bible, why does it start? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the beginning. That's the first foundational truth to everything in the Bible. We believe that that's where we come from. That in the beginning there was, even this morning we were talking in John about Jesus claiming to be I am. And what's that mean? That God is the uncreated creator. He's the uncaused cause. And that in the beginning he spoke everything into existence. You have evolution, on the other hand, who says that, no, in the beginning there was nothing, and then spontaneously, out of nothing, everything suddenly appeared, and you had the Big Bang, that space and matter and time suddenly appeared from nothing. And then over time, you had these things organized themselves into not only planets, but into solar systems and into then single life forms, and through undirected accidental chance mutations over millions and millions of years into life as we see it now. And the question is, what's the truth? I ran across this little comic some time ago, and I think it really shows some of the evidence, or some of the debate and the perception. When people, inside it says a scientific method says these are the facts. What conclusions can we draw from them? And then it's the creationist method. Here's the conclusion. What facts can we find to support it? And that's the, it's this, science first religion. That's the essence of it. Now that's the way it's presented. I think what we're going to find is that actually the exact opposite of what's true. That in my experience, that what you're going to find is you're going to find the scientists, many scientists that are saying, we know there is no God, that's the conclusion, and now how do we get the facts to fit? And even if they can't fit, then how do we reinterpret them? And from a creation standpoint, we're going to come and start and say, we start with the assumption that there is a God, but then we're going to look for the evidence, and all the evidence aligns with that. And it has this criticism that I think it is widespread, but it's not at all right. Now, as we get into this, again, we're seeing every week we're taking a different approach, and I think we need to. This week, I think I have to really start on a very different foot in a sense. And that is that I want to spend some time talking about some really key terms. Because one of the huge problems with this debate is one of terminology. And specifically, there are certain terms that are going to be thrown out there. And if we don't think carefully through these terms, then what happens is whoever wins the argument of who gets to use define the language is going to win the argument. And as Christians, we often don't understand kind of the games that are being played with some of these terms. And so we've got to look at this. I'm going to give you three terms that I think are key, three key issues. The first term is evolution. Now you might say, okay, well that's a really simple one. We all know what that is. That's the teaching of Darwin. All life evolved from the simple to the complex over millions of years. But the concept of evolution is not that simple. And when we use the term, it's not that simple. Because in reality, there are two very different types of evolution. And a huge part of the confusion is really confusion about these two different types. And oftentimes what you have is those that are pro-evolutionists are really try to blend these. They try to put them together, and they try to say that, well, because one is true, therefore the other is true. And in reality, they're two different things. And what we need to realize is that they are two different things, and we need to evaluate each one separately. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the difference between what I'm going to call, or what is called microevolution and macroevolution. Now, microevolution is simply defined, it's the ability for a species to adapt. In other words, it makes small changes to be able to adapt to its environment. Now, the key thing, though, is to realize is that this describes adaptation, not transformation. It describes the ability to make small changes within the species, but there is no change of DNA, there's no change of species. For an example, you think of this, microevolution explains, for example, why dogs come in all shapes and colors and abilities, and yet they're forever distinguishable from other life forms by their unique gene pool as dogs. So we know, if we take vote here, I showed you pictures of my little Teddy a couple weeks ago, and I'm sure we have some dogs that are maybe even smaller than Teddy, and there's some that are a whole lot bigger and different personalities and different. And we have, even here, we have probably a number of different kind of dogs. But if you see your dog, we're going to tell that they're all dogs. Dogs are distinct from cats even, or from other they stay dogs. Now, macroevolution is the process that supposedly creates new innovations. It's complex organisms or body parts. Macroevolution describes the evolution from one species to another species. So in other words, to use that illustration, it would be the ability, let's say, for a dog to evolve and become a horse. Now, here's the problem, is that when people talk about evolution, and Darwin and his theory of evolution, what they think is being described is all the above. It's kind of put into one. And so people will talk about it and conflate the two ideas, and they're very, very different ideas. And there is evidence for one, there is not evidence for the other. Usually, when we'll talk about it here, we're talking about evolution as terms of Darwin evolution, or this macro. So when we think of this macroevolution, that's something that's Darwinism. That's something I'm going to reject. Microevolution, I think, is something that I'm going to not only say accept it, I think that there is a ton of science. If you look at this little chart, this is the idea. Again, macroevolution, you start with single cell, and then you go to a crab, and then to mollusk, and a fish, and a lizard, and a beaver, and a person. Microevolution, you have all kinds of dogs. And that's the idea. You could say microevolution describes the survival of species. Macroevolution tries to explain the arrival of new species. Now, this is the key thing, is there is a tremendous amount of evidence for microevolution. There is, I'm going to say, when I say nearly none, I would say arguably none, zero evidence for macroevolution. What has happened is that is you hear people talk about evolution, and you always hear them talking about microevolution, adaptation. And they'll say, here's this evidence for evolution, for adaptation. And again, and therefore, because there's adaptation, they then jump to the conclusion that we should also have microevolution. That if there's one, there therefore should be the other. And the fact is, that's not the case. That what you have is the ability for something, and I'm going to say, if it was created with a level of complexity that God gave us within not only us, but basically all living beings, that completely believe in macroevolution, believe that because we see this little change from this to this to this, therefore logically we should conclude that if that just continues on, it's going to totally change from species to species. That's a logical argument. There's no evidence behind it. But the conflation of it is that if you have people talk about evolution, well, I don't believe in evolution, and they'll point to all the microevolution. Well, look at this, and look at this. How could you reject evolution? And they'll point to microevolution to try to argue for macroevolution, where there's evidence to try to force you to accept that where there's no evidence. Or if I were to reject it, I don't believe in evolution. Here, let's point over to this. And even if you think about, now again, I'm going to say, like even if you go the case for creator, they do a big evaluation of the whole Darwin and his beach, or the finches and their beaks, and how, some of these, even those things were not necessarily good science. But even if they are true, I mean, that's microevolution. That's the ability to change size of a beak. That's not changing from a finch into a fish, which there's zero evidence for that happening. And that's a whole different thing. And you can't just assume that, that we're going to use these terms. If you use the terms interchangeably, that's what the evolutionists will do. They will take where there's evidence, and they will try to force you to broaden the term to accept where there's no evidence. And what we need to do is we need to separate those. Well, when you talk about evolution, what are we talking? Let's talk about microevolution. I agree with that. I agree there's adaptation. There's a lot of evidence for that. Now let's talk about Darwinism, macroevolution. There's no evidence. And we've got to divide that out. If not, we're going to get, we actually do get in a whole lot of trouble because we let the evolutionists kind of set the agenda. We let them choose the language, choose the meaning, and as a result, they conflate these terms, and they make it sound like there's a lot of evidence for something that in reality there's essentially none. So that's the first term. Second term is naturalism and materialism. Now, that's arguably two ways of saying the same thing. Now, here's the problem, is that if you were to take a science class in a secular university, this is what you're likely to be taught. And you're taught to approach all science in this way, but it's not science. It sometimes would be called even scientism, which is different than science. It's the idea that only the natural and material world exists. And so that what we see in our natural world is all that there is, all that there ever was, all that there ever will be. And so the only way for us to pursue any truth is only through the scientific method, meaning it is impossible to discover any truth apart from observation. Meaning you start with the assumption that there cannot be something that is not materialistic in space and time. You start with the assumption it's impossible that there's something that is supernatural, beyond nature. Now, as Christians, we don't believe in naturalism and materialism. We do believe in science. We believe in nature. We believe in the natural world. But we also believe that there is a God that is outside nature. He is not the result of natural causes. So again, even this morning, for those that were with us this morning, we were in John chapter 18, and Jesus claims, I am. Now what is that? I am the uncaused cause. I am the one that is outside nature. And so he was making a claim that very much aligns with this whole idea that he existed outside of. Now, do we believe in nature? Do we believe in natural law? Yes. But we believe that there is a God that exists outside of that law, that created that law. So therefore, people say, well, it's natural law. Well, if there's a supra-nature being outside of that law, he's not even breaking the law because he's the one that made the law, so he exists outside of the law. He exists above the law. So it's not a matter of breaking the law or not. It's a matter of believing that there is a God that is above nature. Now, you have people that will say, in fact, I remember Richard Dawkins read his book, one of his books a while back, and he begins by trying to argue against God. And his arguments against God were really very juvenile, not very well thought through, but again, if you don't, I could read it and I could say that's really weak. If you have a college kid that has never read it before, it might sound convincing. But one of his arguments against God is, well, for God to exist, God had to evolve to be great enough to be able to create the world, and that's even harder to believe that the world evolved. And I'm sitting there saying, no, you don't understand the whole idea of God. He starts with this assumption that of naturalism and materialism, that all that is possible is natural and material. So even if you talk about God, God had to be natural and material, that God himself had to evolve. And we need to realize that no, that God, by nature, the very idea of God is that God is outside of and above and beyond nature. Now, we believe that God is not inconsistent with nature. In fact, we're going to see that throughout our time that actually God is the most consistent with nature. If you want to understand natural law, natural science, what is revealed, that the belief in God is totally consistent with nature. Although he's consistent with nature, he goes beyond nature. Now, the thing is that when you look at this, they will present this as being science. And they're saying, well, this is science because science, and they're confusing. Again, scientism is saying that all that can exist is material, and therefore it's science. But in reality, it's not science. It's not a scientific theory, it's a worldview. Because they're making certain assumptions about even spiritual things, about who we are and where we come from and where are we going and what life is all about, and where everything started from. I mean, they're making an assumption that basically there was nothing, and out of nothing, everything was created. So they believe in a creation, but their creation is nothing. And there's a nothing that created everything and put order to it. I believe that there's an all-powerful God that existed before nature that created everything and brought order to it. Now, we're going to see the facts. Are they more consistent with a God that exists outside of nature or purely naturalistic evidence? But what you have to realize is it's a worldview. It's even a religious belief, because you're starting with certain presumptions, certain beliefs about there is no God. Well, how do you know that? Can you prove that there is no God? No, you're just making an assumption because I can't prove there is a God, therefore I'm assuming there is no God. But you're not proving there is no God. That's an assumption. It's a leap of faith. It's a leap of faith that, again, let's test the evidence and see, is it consistent with the evidence? Are you stepping out, on a beam that isn't there when all the dirt's fallen to the ground, or you throw it out there and is it consistent with the evidence? I think in my opinion, we're going to find that it's totally inconsistent with the evidence. It's a leap of faith that there is no God. It's a leap of faith saying that everything's, that nothing would be able to create everything. It's a leap of faith that says that non-guided processes of evolution would be able to bring structure to everything. It's a leap of faith about what it means to be human. About all these things, there's certain assumptions of faith that are not science, unless you say that science is purely materialism, which it isn't. See, that's a religious claim. That's a worldview claim. It is not a scientific claim. But again, just like evolution, what happens is they conflate these ideas. They conflate scientism and materialism with science, and therefore they say, we are scientific, and anybody that makes any religious claims is not. Now that leads to a third one, which is very similar to this. It's kind of building on the same idea, and that is that we talk about different spheres of truth or absolute truth. Now this is something that we talked about earlier on, I think the first or second week. And here's the idea here. It's more of a philosophical thing. And it's very, very commonly accepted, again, especially when you talk about within the scientific debate on this issue, is that what is generally argued now is that you have different spheres of truth. Specifically, we have the spiritual and moral truth. That's one sphere, and then you have scientific truth. So when we talk about religious truth, we're talking about one sphere with one set of rules. And so that set of rules, it isn't based on facts, it's based on belief. So if you believe it, it's true for you, because it's not a fact-based thing. Now when we talk about science, well, there we're talking about facts. And so people will talk about these as being two different spheres. And so we have the religious realm, which is belief-based truth, versus the scientific realm, which is true truth and scientific truth. And so you'll hear people that will take these ideas, and even those who claim to be Christians. I don't know if you've ever heard, but I've heard people say things like, well, I believe that the Bible teaches creation, but I know the facts of science tell us that the world evolved. And I've heard people say those things. My faith tells me God created the world, but the facts of science tells us that it's evolved over a long period of time. And so I've heard people that claim to be Christians who've kind of bought into this and don't see the logic or don't see the fallacy of it, where we have two different kinds of truth and there's two different bases of those truth. And what we need to realize is that no, it's nonsense. There's one kind of truth. And when you look at the claims of materialism and of evolution, that is not only a scientific claim, it's a religious claim, it's a historical claim, it's making a claim about what happened in history, about how the world works, about ultimate reality, about where everything came from. It's a truth claim about every aspect of life. When we talk about creation, it's a truth claim that impacts every area of life. And we've got to evaluate each one by each area. Now, here's what happens: is people have argued that, well, we can't teach creation now. This is huge, like in public schools. You can't teach creation in public schools because it's a religious teaching, and we've got to have the separation of church and state. And so therefore, you can't do that. So then you had a group that really got organized and said, okay, we're going to try to put together a material that is not creation, but we're going to call it intelligent design. And so what we're really saying is we don't need God, we just need to realize that the facts of science are more consistent with some kind of intelligent design. And there are a very few people that actually don't believe in God, but believe that there was some kind of intelligent design of alien or something like that. It's pretty rare, but it doesn't require God. It doesn't require a religious belief. Now, people have argued against that and thus far been quite successful in keeping that excluded from being taught in our public schools because they keep coming back and saying it's a religious claim. Now, what they're saying is that anything that makes any statement about God, about any kind of spiritual deity, is religious, and so that should be set aside in a whole different category. But meanwhile, when we talk about the issues of creation or creation or evolution, then we're not talking about religion. We're talking about science, which is really kind of this whole idea of getting back to materialism and scientism and that whole thing of mixing those things. Now, here's where you want to get into the spheres of truth and this worldview. And as much as, you remember that opening kind of illustration, that cartoon, well, here's creation, and we have the facts, and let's get the evidence. And here's what we're going to find is we're going to start to evaluate some of these different views. And what I'm going to tell you is in my experience, the vast majority of evolutionists that I have interacted with, that's people that are, again, just going, college students to college professors, to any of these people, really do not start with an open mind. They will say, that's what science is. Start with an open mind and you leave to where their facts go. They really don't. That what they do is they start with this idea of, this different spheres of truth, and I believe in naturalism, and they start with the assumptions of naturalism and scientism. And they say that, okay, that we're going to start with the idea of rejecting any possibility of something existing outside of nature. So we reject the possibility of God. And now we're going to go look at all the facts with an open mind, knowing that it can't be this conclusion. And so now, hey, look, all the facts show and give evidence of evolution. Well, why? Because that's the only possibility that you've opened up to. Because you've called anything that included something outside of nature as being non-scientific, and it's not even worth considering. So therefore, of course, all the evidence is going to point towards evolution because that was the only conclusion that was possible. And what I think we're going to find here is that if we look at, in this course of this week and some next week, if we really look at the evidence, I'm going to approach it from a standpoint of saying, I'm not going to start and say we need to start and say, here's what the Bible says, and some people will do that. I know some people that have done that. It's kind of like the Bible says it, I believe it, and I'm going to just close my eyes to it, and that doesn't matter what science says because I know it in spite of science. And there have been Christians that have taken that approach and have kind of led into this problem. And I'm going to say, okay, I really want to, if I put them both on the table equal and say it's possible that there's a God and it's possible that there isn't a God or that we evolved. If we evaluate that and say, let's consider both are possible, and we're going to stack it up and say, where's the evidence? Again, to use the whole Indiana Jones illustration, let's pick up the dirt, throw it out there. I've got two places. I'm going to throw out the dirt over here and see if it falls or if it holds out, if it gives me the outline of a plank. I'm going to throw it out here and I'm going to see what happens. And what we're going to find is that I think and trust that you'll agree with me that the vast majority of evidence is far more consistent with the creation worldview. It's far more consistent with the story that there is a God who created, who designed everything, than it is with the idea of scientism, of materialism, that everything is the result of chance and evolution. So, but we've got to see these terms to see that. All right? So keep going. Any comments or questions? Again, if you can, please feel free to join us in line. And any comments or questions you can say as well, and we'll try to get back to you on that. So, but keep going. Good introduction with me. All right. So now the question is there then a conflict between the Bible and science? Because, again, when we start off with this introduction, I think if I were to go out and ask 100 people on random on the streets, the majority would say there's a conflict. In fact, not only that, I think if I were to go in random to 100 different people in different churches and ask, the vast majority would say there's a conflict. I've seen, again, many people, Christians, that have taken the approach of saying, I know that the Bible teaches this, and creation or science teaches this, or again, you have the knee jerk, which it's anything that anybody mentions it, well, the Bible says it, and we're going to close our eyes to science because, and I've seen too many Christians that are afraid of science, and that we've run away from that, that they distance themselves from the discussion. And what has happened is because that has happened, I think that a lot of Christians kind of remove themselves from this debate for an extended period of time, and those that are really pro-evolution kind of had free reign for a while. And so they've defined the terms of the discussion, they've just controlled it, and meanwhile now we're trying to come back, and you have in fact, one of the problems is you have Christian or they're not even all Christian. You have scientists that believe in creation, and they will write papers trying to talk about creation. And you will have the evolutionists that will say, well, there's no peer-reviewed papers that have been approved that by anybody or by that people that uphold the creation view. Well, here's why. You have these well-respected professors that will write a paper on creation, and they get fired from their job. And it's happened numerous times. And so it's kind of like, well, we don't have any peer-reviewed, respected scientists that do it. Well, why? Because when they write a paper, you don't approve their paper and you fire them. And so then you have a number of other scientists that do believe in a creation perspective, but they're not going to say it publicly, because the fact of the matter is it's been such a heavy hand on this discussion where you're not even allowed to admit the possibility. And we're going to see some quotes from people that that basically a few people every once in a while they admit it. But that's the problem, is that it's so run. And then because they want to be able to say that science totally, in fact, that's how many of us see the science, believe the science. And sometimes that's talking about creation evolution. Believe the science. Well, believe, it's the science is again pointing towards God. if you're really saying believe in our scientists and the things that have been approved in scientism and our story. But okay, let's all go look at the science if you really want to look at this. You know what, historically, even though we see there's a conflict, if you go back historically and if you look at it, historically, science was seen as the study of God's design. Historically, there was not a conflict. In fact, if you study the history of science, you'll find until the last 100 years, pretty much all the great scientists were believers. And they saw the work of science as an expression of their faith. In fact, there are many who have argued that there would never be the study of modern science except coming from those who held a biblical worldview. And here's why. It makes sense. Think about this. A biblical worldview teaches that everything is designed by God and has order. Let's say if you started with an evolutionary worldview. An evolutionary worldview teaches that everything evolved by chance. Now, it was only because you had a creation worldview where you had people that believed everything was designed and had order, therefore, we're going to go study it because we can make sense of that which has order. Because you assume order because of design. The whole concept of science grows from a biblical worldview. If you start with an evolutionary worldview where everything is by chance, you would assume a lack of order. And you would assume that, okay, well, if you're starting there, now people, because it's built on the foundation of a biblical worldview, you have evolutionists that will study it, but it's only because you're starting with the foundation of a biblical worldview. It only makes sense if you start with a biblical worldview. And so people have argued that everything in science comes from this biblical worldview. If it really is a random chance and force and without meaning, why study it? Why would you expect to find any order there? It's a product of chance. That's what drove all the early scientists. I could give you tons of these, but let me give you one quote. Johannes Kepler, one of the great scientists of the Renaissance, this is his quote about why you study science. The chief aim of all investigation of the external world should be the discovery of the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God. Now that was the driving, philosophy that drove the study of science. Now, is that the study of science today? No. See, if your world order excludes the possibility of God, then you're not going to study to look at the order that is by the Creator. You assume that there is no Creator. But the opinion of the scientists of the past was that because the Bible teaches there's order, therefore we study it to discover that order. And not only that, but beyond that, if you study the history of science, you find it's not only to study science or to order, but it's actually to study something of God. The study of science was driven by ultimately a contemplation of creation to learn about God. It was a truly biblical pursuit. Now, the amazing thing is the perception is now that the Bible and science are at odds. They're in conflict. Historically, people would have said, no, that they're totally aligned. They would have understood that. And again, you want to see a good example of that? Go back 200 years. Go back in time and go look at where science was taught. You know where it was taught? Seminaries. It was taught in the seminaries. In fact, go back historically and you find a lot of the scientists were trained as pastors. Because the study of science was actually seen as a study of God. It's interesting, you look in the Bible, Psalm 19, for the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies above proclaim his handiwork. Day and day pours out speech, night to night reveals his knowledge. There's no speech, there are no words whose voice is not heard. The voice goes out throughout all the earth, the words to the ends of the earth. What is it teaching? Study nature, because God is declared through nature. What do we read in Romans 1:19? For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So what is it calling us to? Look at nature, because nature declares something about God. And so, in fact, if you look at this, again, this is historically, we've always referred to this as God's revelation. God has revealed himself through nature, an idea that is called natural or general revelation. So, again, the theologians in the past, you have special revelation, which is the Bible. God has revealed himself in a unique and special way, but then generally, he's revealed the natural or general revelation through nature. And so we are called to study God because God's revealed himself. Now, God hasn't revealed everything about himself through nature. That's why we have the Bible. There are things that we have in the Bible that God reveals that are more specific than what we have through nature. But the fact of the matter is God reveals much about himself through nature. And therefore, we're called to study creation to learn some things about God. That's why, again, the study of nature historically happened in seminaries. It was seen as a study of theology. That's why you had, again, all the early scientists, pretty much all of them were Christians. Many of them had been trained even within the seminaries, even as pastors. They saw it as an expression of that. And we're going to be looking at so many of these things, and we're going to see the Bible and science, they're not in conflict. They're totally aligned. And I hope, I'm very interested in this. I've spent a lot of time over the years. Part of it, why? Because I'm studying something in the nature of God. I love the study of science, of creation, because I'm actually learning something about God. That's what motivates me. And I hope that you're amazed by the greatness of God. So then what you're going to find is the question, is the Bible and science in conflict? And the answer, I think, is no. The evidence of science is actually totally consistent with the story of creation. And I'm going to go beyond that and say that I think what we're going to find is that it is far more consistent with the story of creation than it is with the story of evolution. Because again, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at two worldviews, two philosophies. A naturalistic, materialistic approach that says there can be no God, and again, that's something that we're incompatible with. It's something that that's incompatible with Christianity. We're going to see that. But then you have the Christian who believes in God, and what we're going to see is that there's two different ideas, and is most consistent with evolution or with creation. Now, let me give you a perspective on that. And again, I've kind of mentioned this earlier, that you have a few. Basically, you have that early cartoon, saying, here are the facts. How do we find the facts? Every once in a while, you'll get an evolutionist who will be a little bit honest, and they'll say basically, we have our conclusion already, and we're trying to make the facts fit. There's a number of quotes that you have with this, but let me take one. This, I think, is such an incredible quote. This is from a guy named Richard Lowenton. He was a geneticist and a self-proclaimed Marxist. He was one of the world's leaders in evolutionary biology. And he wrote this statement about this philosophical bias. Basically, we believe in naturalism. We believe in materialism, not because of the evidence, but even in spite of it. We've come to our conclusion, we're trying to make the facts fit. Look what he writes. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. Now again, look at our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense. And why do they do that? We take the side of science. Now, when he says science, it's not science, it's scientism. It's materialism. That's where the conflating of the terms, right? So when you read this, don't think science, it's scientism. When we take the side of science or materialism, in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Now you see here, he's drawing it together. It's not the side of science, it's materialism. We take the side of materialism in spite of the fact that the evidence is against us because we have this commitment to conclusion before we look at the evidence. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our arbitrary adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now I appreciate those every once in a while honest statements, but you see, that's the issue at stake here. You have somebody that's saying, we are totally committed to this, and we're going to hold to it no matter how much it doesn't work. And not only that, we can't allow a divine foot in the door. We can't even allow, that's when you have this discussion about, just allow people to teach intelligent design, present it as an option. No, we can't allow it. We can't allow the possibility of God. Why? Because if you allow the possibility of God, suddenly the overwhelming evidence will cascade to show that that is far more consistent with logic and reason. It is far more consistent with the scientific evidence that we have. And so when we look at this, when we say, so does science prove the Bible? Does it prove creation? Well, it goes back to this question of what does it mean to prove? And again, here's where you'll have people, well, you can't prove it. Well, neither can you. And you'll have people in this debate that will hold the Bible and creation to one standard, and then they'll hold their view to another standard. Can you prove it? Well, can I prove God exists? No, I can't put him in a test tube. We can't go back in history and redo the creation. I can't prove it in that sense. But to use the second week, we really talked about these ideas that how are we to evaluate? Well, the same way that you evaluate a court case. You put the preponderance of evidence. Can I prove, that if there's an accusation and you're in court, can you prove unquestionably that this person did it? Can you go back and relive it? No, you can't. But you look at the evidence. And here's the preponderance of evidence so that you're looking for evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And if the evidence is super heavy here and there's, the other side has, really weak arguments, you're going to make a conclusion that the same thing in history. Can you prove that Abraham Lincoln lived? Can you prove that he was shot, by John Wilkes Booths? Can you prove? No, you can't. You can't go back and prove anything historically in a scientific sense of scientific proof. But what you can do is that you can look at the evidence and you can find the propensity of evidence, the preponderance of evidence. And so what we've got to realize is that when we look at this, while it is consistent with known evidence, faith will go beyond what we can know. And there is a element of faith. Because the fact of the matter is God is not provable. Well, and people will say he's not provable because he's not material and you need the material. Well, but your material assumptions aren't provable either. And God isn't provable in that way. And there is a sense that there is a leap of faith, but it should be a leap toward the light, not a leap to the dark, a leap towards that is consistent with reason, that is consistent with what we can see. It is a different quality of not only other religions, but it's a different quality of faith of the atheists. That's where, again, the one book we talked about, I don't have faith to be an atheist. That's the problem, is you throw that out there. I don't have the faith to be an atheist. The leaps of faith that an atheist have to make against logic and reason are far bigger than the leap of faith than a Christian has to make. Because it is the most consistent with reason. It is totally consistent with the known evidence, but it does cause us to go beyond the known evidence. And it causes us to go beyond material explanations. And so that's what we're going to be looking at through here. So that's a lot of introduction, right? I felt we needed to do this is introduction because we don't do these questions. There's so much debate and even confusion about terms, and that's why we need to spend more time on this. So So ready to keep going? Any comments or questions? Again, if you're online, you can text something in. We have the number there on the screen. And if you have a comment or question, please feel free to text that in, and we'd be glad to respond to that. You still with me? All right. So now let's start looking at some of the evidence. I'm going to start doing some just introductory evidence things. First of all, how do we compare some of the evidence? We're going to picking up some of the dirt and we're throwing it out there. And we're going to compare, here's a question, which explanation gives better explanation for this? Now again, I'm doing some heavier science stuff and I'm going very simple explanations on this, but we'll do the best we can. Okay, let's take a really basic law of nature, the second law of thermodynamics. If you were to talk about laws of nature, laws of science, basically things that a law is something that is always true. You have theory, you have the theory of evolution, it's something that's a theory we haven't proven that to be true. You have a law, it's something that's always be true. Now take this for example, we have gravity. I believe it's still considered a theory, not a law, even though from experience we always know it to be true. The law of thermodynamics is something, when you say it's a law of nature, it's something that is unquestionably always true. Now, what's the second law of thermodynamics? I've got a slide that kind of is a little bit bigger. It's altering all things towards entropy or randomness. Molecules move or diffuse from one area of high concentration to low concentration. Basically, if you were to sum it up, the best way to say it is that left on its own, everything naturally moves from order to disorder. As entropy means that as time advances, the universe becomes less and less ordered, and basically energy is winding down. One of the things that even people talked about, it was they used to have what they call the solid state. We're going to get in the Big Bang and all that, but generally until about 100 years ago, scientists were all arguing against the Big Bang. They were trying to insist that the universe existed forever. One of the big problems with that, it's not only goes against reason, but it's not possible with the second law of thermodynamics, because if everything's winding down, if things existed for eternity, the universe will generally run out of energy. So you can't have existed for eternity because it's winding down. All systems left on their own go from order to disorder. Now, you know what? We see this every day. We see this just in our bodies, that we're winding down. It's just, things aren't improving. You get to a certain age and you start going to the doctor more and you have this problem and we're just trying to manage things, but there's not much in the way of improvement. It's just wearing down. We see this, leave your house for a year, come back and see how it's evolved, how it's gotten better. If you leave your house for a year, you'll be amazed. You'll come back and it's like, man, I grew a new room. This is awesome. My dishwasher, it evolved, and so now it's even bigger and more powerful. Now, it doesn't happen. That we know that everything, what devolves, it runs down. It brings disorder. Now, we know that from experience. It's a law of nature that is true across the board. All right, now we have two explanations of how the universe began. Let's evaluate them, all right? One view is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he created it perfect. He created it, and he called it good. And then what happened? Sin came in. And sin came in and began a process. I think especially like Romans 8, the whole creation is groaning in pains of childbirth. Why? Because the effect of sin. It's been exposed to sin. And because of sin, it has brought in disorder. And so the effects of sin continue to work upon creation so that it continues to be impacted more and more over time. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty consistent with what we see and experience. It seems to mesh pretty well. All right, now let's take another view. Evolution states that everything started as total chaos. But the beauty and the life and the complexity we have all grew out of that total chaos because of the law of the survival of the fittest. Now, which one best matched with the law of thermodynamics? That you had chaos that has become order and structure and beauty and organization because of the influence of nature and the survival of the fittest? Or God created, and sin has come and broken that creation, and we've been winding down ever since. And not only that, but when you think about the second law of thermodynamics, is that just a biological law? Or let's think more broadly. You find that it's not only that there's order in our structure and our biology and who we are, but then if you ever study ecosystems and you find there's tremendous order in this ecosystem, and even so much so that, it's amazing that you'll have people that will say, oh, we need to bring in this one species that's going to fix this little problem. The next thing you know, this thing is taken over. I've lived in Florida for a number of years, and they're having huge problems now because people will have these, big snakes, basically, and they have them as pets, and they get tired of them, and they let them loose. And so now you have pythons and all this that are roaming throughout the Everglades, and they're totally doing all this destruction because they're not natural to that ecosystem, because there is a very finely tuned order. Now, what we're saying is that you have that order that was created out of chaos. Well, not only that, but we think about order as far as even in government and family and all those things. Okay, there's an order. Now, did all that order come out of chaos? Did it evolve? How did that evolve? How does that go against with the natural law that basically saying it's not only scientific, but is there, what's more consistent? That you have chaos and suddenly you have order that in spite of the second law of thermodynamics, that somehow the survival of the fittest has increased the order in spite of that law? See, there's no evidence of that happening. And what we find is that people say, well, it's these little adaptations and all these things, and what we've got to realize is that mutations and they improve. You know what we find? The second law of thermodynamics works on the mutation level. Because the whole argument is that if we have all these mutations, we're going to have some good ones and they're going to be passed on. They've gone and they've done, if you do any research, like with fruit flies, where they reproduce real quickly, and they do tens of thousands of generational studies, and they look at this, and you know what they find? Pretty much all the mutations are bad. All of them, in fact, all of them are bad. And they argue that some are good. Oh, look, what this one got got an extra set of wings. And so that's a positive. Well, it's got an extra set of wings, but it can't fly with them. So we can say in theory they're good if they worked, but they don't work. Why? Because mutations are bad. In fact, any of you have mutations in your body? We hear about, like, people talk about X-Men and things like that, and we're going to have these mutations, and all that science fiction is based on this theory. Do you know we do have mutations? You don't want it. You know what you call a mutation? Cancer. That's all it is. You have cells in your body that are mutating and then growing, and generally they don't give you superpowers. They kill you. And so what is that? That's a law that always works. And yet somehow we think that, and there's no evidence that it has never worked, but somehow we think the survival of the fittest is going to overturn that law and make it so that instead of everything moving from order to disorder, now suddenly we started with tremendous disorder and we've moved to tremendous order because the survival of the fittest has overwhelmed the second law of thermodynamics. Which story better fits the facts? I think it's easy. Okay, let's take another one. Let's take the evidence of obvious design. Okay, now we're talking again. Which story better fits the facts? Science should be a search for the truth about the world. Shouldn't be a prejudging. It shouldn't be, I like that explanation. I don't like this explanation, so therefore I come to this conclusion. Again, they make fun of what they say Christians, here's the conclusion, here's the facts. All right, here's what happens. Evolutionary theory, they're basically ruling out a possibility. If you look at nature, what you're going to find is you're going to find evidence of design throughout. In fact, what's interesting is that if you watch any kind of thing that's talking about evolution, they're going to say, look at the design, it evolved. Look at the design, it evolved. But they can't speak of and define anything without invoking design. Now, the fact is that generally when you have a design, it means that you have a designer. And we know this in every other aspect of life, in science and in history, and whenever we have design, it's always a designer. There was a famous guy who wrote this about this theory in a famous way. There's Paley talked about the watchmaker, and basically, if you find a watch, you rightly assume that there must have been a watchmaker. You don't have something that's finely tuned, and it doesn't just appear. You don't walk on this watch and you say, man, here's this watch. It's, I wonder if this one's more evolved than the last. And it's amazing how this evolves on a beach. And no, of course, if somebody said that, they would be laughed out of a room. Because we know that anything we see, not only that, but let's even take really simple things. Let's take, for example, if you walk by and you see this couple and they're sitting there and that's just married, written on the beach, you don't say, isn't that amazing how that just happened? It's, boy, what luck, this couple that is just getting married and the waves just happened to put that stuff. Of course, you would, and again, that would be silly to say. You see design, and it demands a designer. We know that. If you go down to Orlando and you say, okay, well, here's these bushes. It's amazing. Orlando is a magical place. I never knew how magical Disney was. Even their bushes grow to look like Mickey and Minnie. Isn't that amazing? They evolve that way. That's, that was amazing. Or you look at, here's you got Lightning McQueen, and man, it's just. Now, the fact is that we understand. We make these decisions that, of course, this was not an act of evolution. This is not a natural bush. You have specific design, and specific design always indicates a designer. Now, you might say, okay, aren't there some things that seem to have a design? Can't there be an appearance of design that isn't designed? Well, okay, let's talk about this. We have to say, okay, what is the level of we're making an inference, and we're saying, okay, what is how probable and probable is, how specific does it match a recognizable pattern? And so let's take, for example, if you were to drive up in the Northeast, you might come across this mountain up here, this is often called the man in the mountain. And you can look here, and it's, roughly, has a chin and a nose and a forehead. And so this is kind of New Hampshire. It's kind of a well-known mountain area there. And it's referred to the man in the mountain. Now, if I were to say, okay, that was formed by natural causes, we can buy that. All right? Now, if I go to another mountain and say that's formed by natural causes, what do you think the likelihood is? There's a pretty big difference between this. It's not specific design. It's a vague outline, and we can interpret it to say, oh, if you look carefully from this angle, if you look at it from another angle, it doesn't look at all like a face. But from this angle, you could kind of look at it and it seems like a guy's head. And you compare that to this is very specific. I mean, when you see this and you see, the detail and the eyes and the nose, and you could not only tell that they're kind of look like a person, you could tell which four people that they are. Now, one could be, we can naturally infer that it could be, likely be, by natural causes. The other one is very, very specific design, and for you to say that that was caused by natural causes would be just downright silly. That would assume a level of ignorance that I think would be, one is natural, one is designed. I think it's pretty obvious. Now here's the question. As we throw out the evidence for creation, what do we see? The rule is, again, we know that from experience, a design always has a designer. And when you look at creation, there is incredible design. And you cannot, and again, I'm one of these guys that enjoys watching nature shows and things like that. You cannot watch any of these shows and they can't help but talk about design. And the specific design of how this works and all these different things. Or if you talk about the ecosystem and how this works and how intricately designed it is. When you think about a body, I don't know if many of you, some of you may have had this experience where, you start to get sick and you have this problem and you have this problem and you're trying to figure out what it is. And a lot of times it's one thing that is off. It's one chemical that's off a little bit. And it starts to throw everything else off in your body because you're so intricately designed that this one thing that's off throws everything off. And what happens? We're intricately designed. Now, can you say that level of intricate design, if we say that you find a watch and you would say it'd be silly to say that it just evolved. I mean, a human being is millions of times more intricate than, in fact, not only the human being, if you just look at a cell, we're going to come to that in a moment, is so much more involved than a watch. And if we would say that it would be silly for the watch to evolve or for Mount Rushmore to evolve or for the Lightning McQueen bush to evolve, and you know that it would be silly because there's obvious design and the design always demands a designer. All right, we have two stories about how this intricately designed world has come to be. One is that we have an intelligent designer who is all-powerful, who spoke it into existence. One is that you had nothing, and the nothing suddenly became everything. And the everything then by chance suddenly organized itself, and the nothingness organized itself into this intricate design that we now see. Which one do you think better fits the facts? Again, my friends, I think it's not even close. I mean, these are really simple, but they're really basic issues that you look at the basic level. You could see the evidence is so heavily weighted on the side of creation. It's not even close. Okay, let's go another one. How about the problem of irreducible complexity? Now, the whole idea of Darwin's theory of evolution is that what we have is we have simple that evolves to the complex, and that you add one piece at a time. Now, somebody that has written about this, they use the example of a mousetrap. That if you look at a mousetrap, you have a mousetrap. I should have brought one with me, but you have a really simple design. It's got 5 pieces. You've got the little piece of wood. You've got the little bait. You've got the spring that you pull back. You've got the thing that holds it down. You've got a staple that holds it all together, and the piece of wood. If you have one of those pieces missing, the whole thing doesn't work. And so for you to build a mousetrap, you can't build this piece. Oh, how do I make it better and add another piece? No, you've got to add all 5 at once for the thing to work. And here's the problem, is that when you look at, in countless, and there's a guy that's written this whole book about this flagellum, that's, this one part of a cell and the motor of this, and there's so many things like that the biggest level, smallest level, or the biggest level. But you could take so many things. You could take like a human eye. And in theory, you had some kind of amoeba that developed a sunspot that somehow developed the ability to sense light, and then that developed beyond that the ability to see, and then it's just kind of added one step on another. Now the thing is that if you compare like the eyeball to a fish, to an eyeball of even a dog that doesn't see color, to the eyeball of a human, the only thing that kind of ties them together is that they all see. but the parts don't match at all. It's not like, oh, this one is the same as that, but it has these other pieces. They're totally different. They're completely different. And there's no explanation to say, the idea is what Darwin expected at that time was that they should all be the same. This one should just have more pieces. And so it started here, and you kept adding pieces. Now you got this complex. But it doesn't work like that at all. With so many things. I mean, even you could talk about, some of these things are really basic. All right, so you started off and you have a single cell organism that develops the ability to reproduce, to duplicate, right? Now, how do you get from a single cell organism to a mammal where there's a male and female that reproduce through sexual union? Now, not only are there incredibly complicated things of the male and the female and many multiple parts, but the fact is you have to have both of them evolve at the exact same time, because if you had one and not the other, it doesn't work. So how in the world do you, when you talk about irreducible complexity, when you talk even about sexual reproduction, and somehow we went from single cell reproduction to male and female reproduction of anything, there isn't a single kind that single cell reproduction and male and female reproduction is at all alike. And they're not only incredibly complicated, but you needed two at the same time, and then figure out that they needed to come together at that one generation that somehow spontaneously evolved. It's not even, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't come close to making sense. But yet we have this idea, this whole argument, that says that, Darwin's theory is that, it evolved. But the fact is that so much of creation is incredibly complex, and it's not linear, so that it's just, this is a little bit, so many of these things are radical changes. What better fits the facts? And it's interesting, you'll have the evolutionists will try to say, well, no, it does fit the facts. Okay, well, what are the facts that it fits? You know what their argument is? Well, what probably happened is that you had all these steps along the way, one step at a time, but then we lost all the steps along the way. We don't have any historical record of all those steps along the way. There's no evidence of anything, of any living beings that are in between steps. There's no evidence at all. But you know why we believe it? Because we already decided on the conclusion, and we have to find an explanation that fits the conclusion in spite of the total lack of evidence, which is exactly what that one quote was all about, which is exactly the thing that they accuse creationists of doing, but in reality, they're not the ones that are blindly going against science and evidence. It's that materialistic presupposition that is closing the eyes in spite of the lack of evidence and saying, we have to believe this, we cannot let a divine foot in the door. All right, any comment? I'm going to pause just for a moment, and then questions or comments from online are welcome as well. But if we keep going, last part for tonight, and that is we're looking at all these, we're starting to evaluate, and I'm going to go one more level of evaluating, which is, again, this is really simple, and that is, let's look at Darwin. All right, so Darwin is this guy that started this all, and he, in his own writings, in fact, he told us two things, and we're going to take one of the big evaluations tonight. The other one is he talked about fossil records, and you should, say you should expect to find this. If not, the whole thing doesn't work. But let's take one issue of Darwin. And so let's say from what Darwin said he expected to find, and we should evaluate his theory, let's evaluate it. All right, here's what he said. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now we just came out of that and we talked about irreducible complexity. But let's go back and even look at it at a more basic level. He said, if you have complex that couldn't start from simple, then my theory breaks down, you throw the whole thing out. All right, so let's say, what do we know? When Darwin was writing, their ability, they didn't have much in the way of microscopes. And so they looked at the single cell organism and they assumed that it was extremely simple. And he just thought it was literally, they talked about it being like a blob of jelly. And it's really, really simple thing. And so he thought that what you have is this single cell that was so simple that it could happen by accident. And you would take a single cell, and then what we have in animal life and things like that, it was a progress from this simple single cell to this multiplication to a more complicated multiple cell being. Okay, so let's look at the complexity of a single cell organism. These are things that Darwin could not know. It was something that he could not understand. He just thought it was a blob of protoplasm. And what we find is that as we get into it, it's actually an amazing factory. I'm sorry that the slide isn't working here well tonight. But it has this incredible factory, of all these pieces. And, it's 10 million atoms. And it's got, nucleus and nuclear envelope and microfilm. I can't even say all these words. But it's got all these various pieces. And not only that, but if you really get into it, they say it's a factory. It has language. It has decoding systems. It has memory banks, storage information, control systems, self-assembly, assembly processes, replication, so that it replicates the structure. It has DNA, RNA, so that even when you hear about like this whole coronavirus thing, it's doing something to the RNA. It's basically saying that a virus has the ability of reproducing itself, and it's trying to get in there and mess up the reproduction system. It's really trying to get into the factory system of the virus. That's the whole thing with this coronavirus. That's the vaccine. That's how it's designed. So it's this incredibly complex, high-tech factory. So much so that, again, I could spend an hour talking about it and using language that again, I'm trying to read all this and I can't even say all the words. And the fact of the matter is that if his whole idea was that it has to start really simple and move to complex. And if it's proven that there's anything super complex that couldn't have come from the simple, the whole theory breaks down. Well, let's not talk about irreducible complexity. Let's talk about a cell. The most single cell, the first living cell, had such a level of complexity that this is high-tech factory. It's something that is, again, people say it's more complex than any factory that you would find that exists anywhere. I mean, the ability to self-replicate like that, it's incredibly complicated. And so what you have is at the cellular level, Darwin, by his own standard, is saying, okay, this would disprove him. But it actually gets worse for them. Because when you look at the cellular level, that's the cell. Well, the cell is made out of proteins. And so let's think about the proteins. Okay, if you were to look at the protein, that's even more basic. That's not something that's living. But when you have this whole idea, the whole idea is that Darwin had this idea, this theory that chemicals existed in some sort of water, and they talked about the primordial soup, and then lightning come and struck that soup and caused the chemicals to combine and spontaneously create life. So it's, you'd hear chemical revolution. That's what they would talk about this. Now, people have tried to simulate this in labs, and what they've done, it's interesting, they try to create what they believe is the perfect environment, strike it with the right electrical charge to get the chemicals to combine. Now, there was one famous experiment with a couple scientists who were able to get a couple chemicals to combine into what's called an amino acid, which is not a protein. It's on the way to becoming a protein. But number one, this was designed. They were designing and trying to do things and say, how is the ideal circumstance? Can we make it happen? And they made it happen somehow for a part of a protein in ideal circumstances, not the ones that would be on a barren planet. And not only that, they only got part of the way, and then those amino acids didn't evolve to become proteins. They actually broke down again to become the base elements. And not only that, they only created amino acid, not a protein, and it's only one of building blocks. And so it's like a you think about a letter of the word. We need to build a word, and so that's only one of the letters. So, people talk about, we're going to say in a minute, talk about in a moment information, and you're trying to put these words together, and it's not only a matter of putting the words, you don't even have the letters to put the words together. And so all you have some wood chips, and you're somehow thinking that these wood chips are going to come together and form letters, and then the letters are going to come together and form words, and all this is going to be happening by process. And so it's saying it's not only that, but then these amino acids had to form, which they don't do in natural, and they break down, but instead they needed to form, and then the amino acids need to organize themselves into a protein. It's hundreds of letters in the perfect order, have to organize themselves in proteins. There's no evidence that ever happens, that we can't make it happen, by creating the right environment. And the most simple single cell is made up of not only of a protein, but of multiple types of proteins. So somehow, these are not living beings. See, here's the problem, is that evolution is about living beings evolve. A protein isn't living. You see, you're talking about these ideas of, a protein is not a living thing. It's elements that somehow are struck together by lightning, form together into amino acids, and then these amino acids accidentally arrange themselves in the right order to form a protein, and you have all these proteins somehow arrange themselves so that you have multiple different types of proteins that all arrange themselves, and then somehow spontaneously they come together and they form into a cell which spontaneously becomes life. All right, does that sound really logical? By Darwin's standards, it is so complex. And Darwin's saying if you could have complex without the simple, my whole theory breaks down. It doesn't work. The whole theory was you start with simple, you move to complex. And what we find is what you thought was really simple is incredibly complex, way more complex than you ever dreamed. And so if you just go by Darwin's standards, it breaks down. There's some of this, even some scientists will try to explain and acknowledge they can't. Again, I mentioned Richard Dawkins, a big proponent of teaching evolution. And he tries to explain this by talking about the anthropic principle. And basically, his argument isn't what the one guy said, we believe this in spite of the evidence, his argument is basically saying, now again, remember in the beginning of this book, God is impossible because only natural explanations, and then he spends his whole time making fun of people who believe in God because all the evidence is for creation or for evolution. Well, of course it is because God isn't possible. But then he comes and he gets to questions like this, and he acknowledges that this, and there's multiple questions like this, that you just have to acknowledge that it is practically impossible for it to have happened. It just, the chances of this, it's beyond comprehension and possible. And you could give the universe however many billions of years, this is never going to happen. But his argument is the anthropic principle, which is basically, we exist, so therefore we know it happens, so we got really, really, really lucky. And there's 4 or 5 things that's his conclusion. I agree it's totally impossible, but we're here, so it must have happened. So the anthropic, the human principle, we know we're here, so therefore it proves that we must have really gotten super, super lucky. Now, does that sound like a scientific explanation of the facts? Or is it, I've come to the conclusion, and no matter how much the facts are against me, I can't let the divine foot in the door, and I've got to hold to the things that I've concluded from the beginning, because I'm not willing to consider any other possibility. Darwin is right, even though by his own standard, he's been proven wrong. One more thing by Darwin. Okay, how about DNA and the information of life? This is, again, something Darwin had no idea about. You see, the whole idea of DNA, we didn't understand what DNA was. And when you look at DNA, what we found is that it's not only matter that has organized itself into life, supposedly, because we're not just biology, we're not only matter, we're also information. And so DNA is not just matter, it's information. And so it's really saying, can you have random chemicals organize themselves into complex proteins and come together, and not only doing that, but then putting together information with basically, which is almost the equivalent of, it's way more complicated, in fact, it would be like a computer code. Can you have this write itself into this code, this incredibly complicated code of information? And here's what they're finding is that when you think of information, anytime you find information, organized information never comes from a disorganized source. We know that by experience. How many of you have heard of SETI? This SETI, it's Search for Extraterrestrial. It's a thing somewhere out in Arizona or somewhere like that, where they've got all these giant dishes going out to space, point out to space, listening. And they're listening for intelligent life. Now, there's a lot of noise in space. Now, how do they find intelligent life? What are they looking for? Organized patterns, yeah. Any kind of organized pattern. And the assumption, if it's an organized pattern, any kind of organized regular pattern, it must be from intelligence. Because any kind of organized regular pattern it wouldn't come from nothing. And every once in a while you might hear something that sees a little bit, but then if you listen a little longer, you miss the pattern. And that's nature. Nature creates maybe a little sense of pattern for a short period of time, but not extended. So they're listening for pattern because we know that if you hear a pattern, it comes from an intelligence. Now that's a simple message. All right, now do you know how much message is in DNA? In a simple strand of DNA of a simple single-cell life, it's like a set of encyclopedias. And it's got to be perfect. And so if you were to now come alongside and realize that it's not just a matter of biology, of organisms, of the stuff of life coming together and organizing itself, but then you have to have, in basically the computer code to run that life, you have to have this information, high level of highly organized, structured information, that it came together on its own at the same time that life came together. How likely is that? They say information is the heart of life, our uniform, repeated experience. It tells us that matter by itself never produces information. The only known source of capable information is a mind. And let me just close even in this illustration. If you look at it and you say, okay, here you have, these, what's the chance that this happened by chance? You have Scrabble squares, to be or not to be. That is the question. If I were to tell you I just poured this box out and that's what came out, would you believe me? How many times would I have to pour the Scrabble squares out to get that? I could sit there my whole life and I would never get it. Now, we know that. We know that by experience. You're never going to get two lines by random chance. Now, it's actually much worse than it appears. Because again, it assumes that first of all, you have the letters. You start here, you don't have the letters in DNA, so they're not only that this would have, at least I'm starting with the letters, and not only that, but these are two lines, and DNA has thousands of pages, and every letter must be perfect for it to work right. And some people will say it's progressively over time, and the argument would be, well, if you gave a bunch of monkeys a bunch of typewriters, and you had them, typing nonstop for millions of years, you got millions of monkeys for millions of years, eventually they're going to type out Shakespeare. And that's the argument. That's the real argument. Now, the thing is that I might get a million monkeys, and I might get one to get one word, and then the next word. I'm never going to get one monkey that's going to type out the entire, entire play of Hamlet. That's never going to happen. They might get a couple words. They're not going to get a whole book. One monkey is never, and that's what you need with evolution. You don't need, one monkey each getting a bunch of words, and you get a million monkeys, and sooner or later they're going to put together a book. You need one monkey to get all the book. And again, that assumes that you have the monkeys and the typewriters. Where do they come from? With DNA, you don't have the monkey or the typewriter, and you're saying that by chance you're going to have this thousands of page information somehow come together. And again, this is not selective mutation because there is no mutation. There is no life for it to mutate. This is how life begins. And so you cannot even get the beginning of life. You see, when Darwin says, okay, you can't get the complex with, can't go from complex unless you start with a simple, the most simple form of life, the single cell, you don't have the cell, you don't have the proteins to build the cell, and you don't have the information to build. You don't have any of those things. You're nowhere close to those. Here's how bad it is. Again, this is like a quote from what we said in the beginning. This is from DNA code discoverer Francis Crick, not a Christian. He says this: biologists must consistently keep in mind that what they see is not designed, but rather evolved. And what's he saying? We have to constantly remind ourselves that we have the conclusion, and we have to ignore the facts because the facts tell us that tell us otherwise. We've come to the conclusion, and we have to ignore the evidence. And again, my friends, what you see here is that the evidence is so incredibly strong. And again, I've studied this a good amount. You don't have to be a deep scholar to understand this. These are really basic things, and then you could take any of these things and you could talk about, again, we talk about irreducible complexity. There's a guy that's written a whole book about a flagellum within a single cell and how to break that, but you can look at so many things and you see that evidence. You can see on DNA, all these things, they're just overwhelming. And what you have is those who believe evolution come to a conclusion. They're naturalists, materialists, and they're closing their eyes saying, we're not going to let the divine foot in the door, and so we're going to believe what we believe in spite of the evidence, in spite of the absurdity of our claims, because we've come to this conclusion, and we have to close our eyes to the facts. As a follower of Christ, as a believer in the Bible, I believe that the facts totally fit the story that we have in Genesis chapter 1. The Bible is not opposed to science. The Bible is totally consistent with science. And the more that we understand, the more confident that we're going to be in what we believe and the ability to defend it. The more that we're going to be able to answer the questions of skeptics, if they are at all open-minded, which unfortunately too often they're not. Well, we're going to get into this a little bit more next week, and then we'll wrap up next week with kind of touching from this whole creation-evolution debate and how it impacts question of morality. And where does morality come from, and how can a good God allow evil, which is, and they're actually closely related. So we're hopefully going to have time to get into both of those next week. But let me close in prayer. Father, I thank you for the chance that we can spend again this evening. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this issue. Father, thank you for the truth. Thank you for the truth and for revealing yourself through not only the Bible, but through creation, and for the privilege that we have to study creation and to be amazed at what you revealed about yourself. Father, thank you again that you call us to a faith that is a faith that goes against logic and reason, but consistent with. Father, help us to grow in confidence, not only confidence, but even excitement about what we believe and why we believe it. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you, and thank you again for joining us online.